Greetings, friends and family. My name is Shingima Vima, and this is Pan-African Conversations. I'm back with another video today. I told you I'd be a little more active this year compared to the last couple of years. So this is our third new video. The last two, which both had 2 parts to them. I'm not sure how many parts this one is gonna have, but I also gonna upload the totality of it in one go. But I'm talking about something pretty contemporary right now, current affair issue, but still seismic in its nature, right? And as with many things happening around the world right now, you can't talk too much without arriving on the albatross that is Donald J. Trump and his administration this year. So I'll be talking today about the situation with South Africa, right? You may remember in February, it wasn't the first time that the Trump administration, even the first time he was around, this came up as well. But in February this year, tweets came out that were coming from DJT himself and supported by Elon Musk and even Marco Rubio had some things to say. It was the Secretary of State, right? In which they were talking about how land was being seized in South Africa and those implications that white farmers were being killed in what amounted to something of a white genocide in South Africa. So that is the conversation I'll be talking about. I'll be not only evaluating the validity of those claims, but sort of situating the land, the history of land in South Africa within the long durée trajectory of colonialism to the post-colonial era, right to the contemporary day, what it all means, and what we can glean from all the situation, and why the Trump administration has been talking like this to South Africa and about South Africa. So let's lock in, and I hope you enjoyed this one. It's taken me a while to get this one done. It has. And because it's a contemporary affairs issue, just when I thought I was going to get done, something else came up. To such an extent that I was just finishing it last week. The video, I was finishing it last week, at least the script for it. I was finishing it and recording it last week. And as I was doing that, I was like, man, we've already moved on. People are talking about there's so many other, what with Zelensky and Ukraine and Russia sort of taking center stage, among other things, the tariff wars, Canada, and so forth. This has already left the headlines. Then Friday, more than a month and a half after the initial comments when I decided to make the video, again, there were a few more comments coming from the Trump administration about South Africa. So that's what's pushed me, inspired me to wanna record this particular video. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you at the end. So the tweet read, South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. It is a bad situation that the radical left media doesn't want to so much as mention. A massive human rights violation, at a minimum, is happening for all to see. The United States won't stand for it. We will act. Also, I will be cutting off all future funding to South Africa until a full investigation of the situation has been completed. That was on 3 February 2025. The same day, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, responds, South Africa is a constitutional democracy that is deeply rooted in the rule of law, justice, and equality. The South African government has not confiscated any land. The recently adopted Expropriation Act is not a confiscation instrument, but a constitutionally mandated legal process that ensures public access to land in an equitable and just manner as guided by the Constitution. South Africa, like the US of A, and other countries, has always had expropriation laws that balance the need for public usage of the land and the protection of rights of property owners. We look forward to engaging with the Trump administration over our land reform policy and issues of bilateral interest.
We are certain that out of these engagements we will share a better and common understanding over these matters. Then he goes on to say a few things about their existing partnership. To which point, co-president, the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, retweets this or and says, "Why do you have openly racist ownership laws? Why do you have openly racist ownership laws?" Now, Trump's concern with this issue is not new. In 2018, for example, he shared similar sentiments upon the prompting of Tucker Carlson, it would seem, in which he said, "I have asked Secretary of State Pompeo to closely study the South Africa land and farm seizures and expropriations and the large-scale killing of farmers. South African government is now seizing land from white farmers." That's what he was retweeting, Tucker Carlson and Fox News. So while not entirely unprecedented then, there has been some surprise as to how South Africa has taken some version of center stage in Trump's foreign policy this early into his second term. I mean, the average American or neutral would not have had this on their bingo card, would they? Well, maybe, right? 47 second term has started with beefs and gripes with such formidable American foes as China, sure. Canada, what? Panama and Denmark? Then, of course, there is the Musk factor. Oh boy, and we'll get into all that. But beyond the political grandstanding, what is the actual issue here? Right? If you're to heed the central thesis of those messages, it's two things, right? One, the killing of farmers and the land seizures, right? Land being seized from white farmers. That's who he's talking about. These are the classes that he's talking about. But after all, murders of white South African farmers, while sad and unacceptable, made up 0.2% of all murders in the nation, where white people are 7.8% of the population. 0.2% of the murders, 7.8% of the population. If anything, South Africa has a murder problem. Land seizures as well. Well, let's talk about that. That 7.8% white South Africans owns 72% of the land to this day, which is not too far a cry from the numbers at the height of apartheid or at the height of the Native Lands Act of 1913. We'll get to talking about all that. So whence cometh the noise? In this video, we're going to talk a bit about how land ownership got to be what it is today in South Africa, what the situation actually is, and maybe venture at what's motivating the current furor here as being initiated by the US. As with many contested post-colonial legacies, the quote-unquote encounter point is always a good place to start. So we'll run through that real quick, shall we? Vasco da Gama, Portuguese explorer, first reached the Indian Ocean in 1497 during his voyage from Portugal to India, right? Sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, then entered the Indian Ocean in late November, to early December of 1497. The first European to do so. And the Portuguese, who were essentially the truck drivers of the era, and I don't mean that in any disparaging way, they were experts of sea travel, right? Of commercial sea travel at the time, unmatched. And they ran that route for the next 100 years. By then, late 1500s though, the Dutch have also entered the arena. And in 1595, the first group of Dutch sailors stopped by the Cape of Good Hope, and under the auspices of the Dutch East India Company, also known by the initials VOC in Dutch. And so they start settling there. In 1652, however, it is Jan van Riebeeck, who ends up really setting up shop over on the Cape and set up a trading station there, right? So now they've set up a station, and that date, 1652, marks the beginning of the European colonization of South Africa. 1652, when the Dutch under Jan van Riebeeck set up shop. Now, who was it that Jan van Riebeeck and the Dutch met when they settled at the Cape? Well, it's a group collectively known as the Khoisan, right? Now, the term itself is dubious. It's really two groups of people, right? There's the Khoi, who are mainly the pastoralists, the cattle herders, and the San, who are mainly the foragers. But that line is thin, and sometimes they are, So we collectively they are known as the Khoisan. They wouldn't have called themselves that, but that's how they that's the accepted nomenclature. But the Khoi in particular, because they are the indigenous people of that region. They've been there for 150 to 200,000 years, right, of the Cape of Southern Africa. The cattle herders would typically have a cattle surplus because they live out there by themselves and they aren't really in contact with too many groups of people, so less conflict. So initially, when the Dutch settled there to trade with them, they were only ever so delighted to do so, because that meant that they could trade some of their older cattle, sicker cattle, excess, whatever, anything that they had surplus, and they would get tobacco, they would get beads, they would get coins, these sort of trinkets, But it's fine, it's easy living. But once the Dutch had settled there, they wanted more. Now they want more cattle, and these guys have less, so the cattle prices from the Khoi start to rise. The Dutch don't like that. They settle, they start claiming more land, right? Raiding cattle, claiming more land, using their relative military might, right? Because a lot of soldiers had traveled with the Dutch East India Company and they were there. And soon, the company, seizing Khoi cattle and so forth, right? Again, colonial activity is afoot now, right? And soon the Dutch East India Company, began releasing some of its soldiers from their contracts and allowing them to set up as independent citizens of the colony. And a lot of them got these huge farms, and they started to call themselves the Boers. Boers meaning farmers in Dutch, right? So Boers, which was a denotation of the profession that these folks were now getting into. They were no longer soldiers, now we are farmers, Boers. Now, faced with the expansion of white settlement onto their traditional summer grazing lands, the Khoisan managed to unite in armed opposition. This was not like them. They just lived in their small clans and families, but in this time they actually organized and united in armed opposition in 1659. And while early on they were able to actually push the Europeans back to the fortress, right, that they had set up, despite several brave attempts, the Khoisan were unable to overrun the Dutch fortress itself. And after months and months of just being stuck in this place, the Khoisan alliance fell apart. Van Riebeeck, this is incredible. This here is incredible. Van Riebeeck recorded in his journal the minutes of his meeting with the Khoisan leaders after the alliance had fallen apart. And this is what Van Riebeeck says. They spoke for a long time about our taking every day for our own use more of the land which had belonged to them for all ages, and on which they were accustomed to pasture their cattle. They also asked whether, if they were to come to Holland, they would be permitted to act in a similar manner, saying, it would not matter if you stayed at the fort, but you come into the interior, selecting the best land for yourselves, and never once asking whether we like it or whether it will put us to any inconvenience. They therefore insisted very strenuously that they should again be allowed free access to the pasture. They objected that there was not enough grass for both their cattle and ours. Are we not right, therefore, to prevent you from getting any more cattle? For if you get many cattle, you come and occupy our pasture with them. and then say the land is not wide enough for us both, who then, with the greatest degree of justice, should give way, the natural owner or the foreign invader? They insisted so much on this point that we told them they had now lost that land in war and therefore could not expect to get it back. It was our intention to keep it. Quintessential colonial text, right? Might makes right. Okay. So thus, claiming right of conquest, Van Riebeck simply overrode all Khoisan protest, and the Boers remained in occupation of the Cape. Thereafter, you start to see more and more Dutch settlers coming in, as well as other European ethnicities, particularly the French Huguenots, who are a French Protestant group that was being persecuted, and they come through in the late 1600s, and they too get granted land by the Dutch East India Company that is now firmly ruling, controlling the Cape. So after the Second Khoi-Dutch War, the Boer settlements expanded rapidly, moving across the Cape Flats. They settled in places that are great for agriculture, like present-day Paarl and Stellenbosch. So they're promoting this direct immigration with the Huguenots and other Dutch settlers. And by the 18th century, the white population reached 1,000. By then, the colony was growing enough wheat to feed itself and sell a surplus for export. So the Capes, one of the reasons why the Cape climate worked so well for the Europeans was it's very similar to Mediterranean climate. That's why to this day, the vineyards are there, you grow wheat and these things. So much of the farm labor, though, came from, you guessed it, slaves imported at the rate of 200 to 300 a year from Madagascar, Mozambique, and Indonesia, right? So they numbered 25,000. By the 1800s, there was 25,000 of them, with a total white population of 21,000. So again, we've already seen several times, from the seizing of the land to the conversation with the cattle to enslavement, which, by the way, this is part of the same enterprise as the transatlantic slave trade. Now, obviously, this is not part of the trade. This is not across the Atlantic, but the Dutch, as a Western European power at the time, they were involved in the same trade. Of course, they've been involved in the actual transatlantic slave trade. This is just another leg of enslavement, right? Just happening, of course, with the Indian Ocean and South Africa as the site of this experience. So, in many ways, they are part of that global economy that is operating under the auspices of the transatlantic slave trade. In any case, these Boer settlers, emboldened, of course, by their seemingly easy defeat of the Khoisan, and now with the muscle that is slave labor, they begin expanding and expanding more, leaving the coast, the Cape, moving inland, right? These are the folks we call the trek Boers, right? The wagon, that's the trek, or traveling as the trek, as they travel away from the Cape and move inland and set up shop. And by the administration of the Dutch East India Company, they were able, these Boers could claim up to 2,500 hectares of land, and when they ran out of that, get some more. And for all their sons, and remember, these folks had a lot of kids, they would be promised similar amounts of land as well when that happens. So they are expanding. But as they expand, they start running into other groups of Africans. It's not just the Khoisan there. And one group that they ran into was the Xhosa. Now, the Xhosa, initially they traded with the Xhosa, who just viewed them as another group, albeit a white group, but just another group that was of pastoralists that was around the area, people to trade cows with, even some of the Dutch settlers married into the Xhosa ethnic group. However, in time, because colonizers are going to colonize, the Dutch settlers, the Boers, they want to claim more land. That's what they do. And this result, beginning in the 1760s, in the in the frontier wars, what I call the frontier wars. And in the first three frontier wars, these wars are not decisive. The Xhosa are a lot harder to defeat than the Khoisan. Now, the Khoisan were no punks, but the Xhosa, by virtue of how their society is organized, they are not just a series of different clans here and there. They are a whole society of folks, right? They've with even a more militant-minded society, a more sedentary community. So they even have a space that they're actively trying to defend. So the social organization means that they're a lot harder to defeat. Now, they'll be defeated later, which we'll talk about shortly, but by the Dutch settlers, by the Boers, they were able to retain much of their land. Now, the Dutch do make some gains, right, as they expand their territory in Southern Africa, modern-day South Africa, but the Xhosa are able to retain a lot of their land. This is in the 1760s, going forward. However, while all this is happening, a specter is hanging over the head of this region entirely. And that's a specter we call the British, The British have entered the arena. We say the Portuguese got here first and the Dutch, but by the late 1700s, right, the late 18th century, the British, who have been expanding, and sort of exploring other ways of securing their gains, especially as they pushed for the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as a whole, especially as they continue to be the leader at the time in the Industrial Revolution. They're looking for other ways in which they can secure resources, right? They are headed to India, right? Obviously, they're headed to India, which they, as we know, they end up colonizing by the early 1800s, but they've established those routes. So they're also coming down the the Southern Cape and going off into India. And eventually in 1795, they set up shop on the Cape. And while the Dutch initially were happy to have the British there, because you know what? It's the big homie, right? You have another, what is arguably the world's superpower at the time, the British, coming in, somebody that they can trade with, fellow Christians even, that you can maybe be in community with. However, the British, again, because colonizers are going to colonize, even if it's against fellow colonizers, they begin to expand their territory. Right? So, after having seized control of the Cape Colony from the Dutch East India Company in 1795, trying to establish a supply station for their ships to India, what this actually led to, initially, after the initial good graces, the Dutch soon begin to feel persecuted by the British. Why is that? Well, one of the things that the British do immediately is to ban slavery. Because remember, this is the kick that the British were on at the time, the banning of slavery, right, by 1807. And this created a initial shortage of labor for the Dutch. The British proclamation soon tidied up controls over free labor in the colony, right? According to the so-called Hottentot Code, which again, the Hottentot is a pejorative term used by the Dutch for the Khoisan people. All Khoisan, so they put in place this Hottentot Code, which is a forerunner of the past system that would define apartheid. But this is back in 1809. All Khoisan and free black men in the colony had to carry passes showing where they lived and who their employer was. Anyone without a pass could be contracted to the nearest white colonist who needed labor. So they're not just controlling the land, but they're controlling the labor in that way. Indeed. So this has happened. And the Dutch, the Boers, they don't like this. Because remember, they were subsisting large at that point on the slaves, right, that they were bringing in from Indonesia, Mozambique, and Madagascar. To make matters worse, as British missionaries started to come in to the colony as well, they start to advocate for better for the Khoisan even, right? Just better treatment, better wages, contracts, and so forth. This gave the Khoisan some degree of freedom, much to the annoyance of the local Boer employers. So what happens here? What happens? The Dutch feeling. So what is this Great Trek, right? So the Great Trek is this migration of thousands of Boer settlers who now go by the name the Voortrekkers from they're traveling from the Cape Colony into the interior of South Africa as a way to dissociate or be away from British rule, which they're dissatisfied with due to their policies on land and slavery, as we have seen already. And in Boer national law, and eventually Afrikaner national law, the Great Trek assumes this mythical, if you can imagine the Israelites leaving Egypt, right? Or the concept of manifest destiny as you hear it in the US, for example. It's that sort of vibe, right? It becomes this God-ordained conquest of these lands. But to the African groups that they were encountering, right? This is nothing, it's just an invasion, right? There's nothing God ordained about this. It's an invasion. But again, the framing of this as being God ordained is very, very important in that it foreshadows the continuation of this land disparities and this feeling of entitlement to the land of South Africa by certain groups of people. This is what's happening here. It is also during this Great Trek that we see one of the more pervasive myths that is particularly relevant to the land issue today. That's when it comes into play, and this is the idea we call the empty land theory. What is the empty land theory? I hear you asking. The empty land theory is a now largely discredited historical claim that suggested that large parts of South Africa were uninhabited or sparsely populated before European, again mainly the Afrikaner or the Boer settlement in the 17th and 18th century, right, going into the 1800s. This idea was used to justify colonial Afrikaner nationalists to justify this land seizure. So it says that when we got here, sure, there were a few Khoisan that we dealt with here, but there was largely nobody else, right? And when we went further inland, those guys, the Bantus, the Zulus, the Xhosas, they were not there, right? The idea, the suggestion being that they got there maybe around the same time that the Europeans did, or even later than them, right? Which is crazy, and this argument ends up being especially useful in defending policies like the 1913 Natives Land Act, which we'll talk about, which restricted black land ownership. We'll get to that. So again, we call it a theory, right? Or some people will just outright and call it a myth, empty land myth, right? Because it's been conclusively proven to be false, right? So you have archaeological and linguistic evidence, such as Bantu-speaking communities that had reached South Africa by 500 in the Common Era, and you find complex societies like Mapungubwe out in Limpopo flourishing long before European contact, right? You also have oral histories. You even have European observations, the Dutch and the Portuguese themselves talking about, encounters with well-established African societies, right? Indeed, and so you get these things. The Khoisan, the Xhosa, the Tswana were already thriving across different regions of South Africa. But we'll get back to this idea of the empty land theory, but it just shows the machinations, and again, this idea of dog whistling as a means to distort what's really happening on the ground, to use that as a basis to claim land from the African people is not a new thing, but we'll get back to that. So anyway, the Boers have gone through the Great Trek, and eventually they set up shop. They have their republics that they set up, right? Two states that they set up, the South African Republic in 1852, and 2 years later, the Orange Free State in 1854. So these are the republics that they have set up with land taken from different Bantu groups that they had encountered as they traveled up north, and they're safely away from the British at the Cape, right? Right? But again, colonizers are gonna colonize. You'll get used to me saying this, because eventually the British, with their imperial intentions as well, were not content just staying at the Cape, right? Of course not. Of course not. One, by the time we get to the mid 1800s, the scramble for Africa, quote unquote, is starting to take shape. And there's a threat here from other European powers, possibly Germans, right? Definitely maybe the Portuguese, who have land holdings in Portugal and have begun the colonial project in Angola. They could possibly slip in and claim some territory. So the British want to make sure that even though they've taken care of the Boers, that they still prevent these other guys from claiming, quote unquote, what could be. And as a result of this, they began that expansion inward. And the first group that felt their wrath, as it were, was the Xhosa. Now, the Xhosa and the Dutch had fought in 3 frontier wars. Remember those? Which had been inconclusive, right? The Dutch had tried their best, but they could not fully defeat and claim land from the Xhosa. So the Xhosa had retained the vast majority of their land. The British picked up from there in the 4th frontier war, right? The first 3 had been against the Dutch. Then the 4th one was now the British versus the Xhosa. This was the first time that the British were directly involved militarily against the Xhosa. They had something that the Dutch did not, though. And that was a standing army. Which, if modern European weapons at the time were already difficult to fight against, ones being administered by the standing army of one of the biggest militaries at the time, crazy. Worn down. But still, it took almost a century. The 4th frontier war was in 1811. The 6th one was the biggest one. Was the biggest one, and that was in 1834, and really expanded control further eastward here. The last Xhosa war, the 9th frontier war, was in 1878, 1879. Right? That's way late. That's about the time of the Battle of Isandlwana against the Zulus, and But this final conflict, which led to British annexation of the remaining Xhosa lands and the full incorporation of the Eastern Cape into the Cape Colony, 1879. Okay. Something else seismic has happened between 1811 and 1879. Let's say 1866 to 1867 to be specific. And that is the beginning of the South African Mineral Revolution. And this is key. The Southern African Mineral Revolution. In 1866, this is important, diamonds are discovered at Kimberley, right? Diamonds are discovered at Kimberley. And this has incredible ramifications for the region as a whole. On one hand, Kimberley is outside of the Cape, is away from the Cape, which is now the British domain by now, right? But how it is also outside both the Transvaal, definitely pretty far from the Transvaal, but also outside the Orange Free State, just outside the Orange Free State where the Boers have settled. Oh, by the way, just to emphasize this, that during the Great Trek, which we spoke about earlier, this idea of the Dutch descendants, aka the Boers, calling themselves Afrikaner, starts to take shape, largely buoyed by the mythology of the Great Trek, and to differentiate themselves from the British and other European settlers. Afrikaner is to say we are the white tribe of Africa, essentially. So they do that to really assert that So this is, and the language Afrikaans, which is a bastardized form of Dutch intertwined with maybe African elements and other elements, French elements from the Huguenots and other things like that, develops. That's so when I start talking about the Afrikaners going forward, that's the group that I'm talking about. So in any case, it's outside of their very. In fact, if this place Kimberley belongs to anybody, it belongs to a community known as the Griqua, and the Griqua are what we may call colored. They are mostly mixed. Some Dutch descendants mixed with some of the slave descendants and some Khoisan people, right? At the Cape, they would typically be called Cape colored, but because they had moved inland, or pejoratively called the bastards sometimes, but they call themselves the Griqua. So the Dutch, once gold is, diamonds are discovered over there, the Dutch try to claim, say, hey, this is our own Orange Free State, but the British are not having that, right? And after negotiating with the Griqua, the British end up being the dominant authority within that region. Plus, remember, the British have already industrialized. They've been on the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. So even their mining technology is top tier. And they really emerge to the forefront and become more dominant in the region as a result of the discovery of diamonds at Kimberley. What it also leads to is an influx in migration from different African groups around Southern Africa, as far as Mozambique, Zimbabwe, because with the early onset of colonization in their own countries and in their own communities, and the shift away from pre-colonial economies towards a cash economy, the jobs that people could work now to get paid in cash and so forth were now in the diamonds. It is also in this time that a company known as the De Beers develops a monopoly over the diamond trade. A British company known as the De Beers develops this monopoly. And you know who's at the top of it? A fella named Cecil John Rhodes, right? The veteran colonizer for whom Rhodesia would later be named and who would later on become the Prime Minister of the Cape colony, as it were. So, again, this moment in mining history ends up being central to the colonial project of Southern Africa. In 1871, the British annexed Griqualand, right, including Kimberley, into their territory, further asserting themselves as really the top colonial force within this space over the Dutch, over the Boers or the Afrikaners now. The Afrikaners are still fighting against different groups of Africans that they're fighting, including a protracted war with the Pedi, who are a bit further north in the area with modern day Gauteng, right? And this almost bankrupts the Boers, right? This almost bankrupts the Boers. And the British, the whole time they've been playing a long con. Their goal is to amalgamate all the wide settled areas within that region, right? So they wanted to eventually, even though they had pushed the Dutch settlers, the Boers, the Afrikaners further north, where the Afrikaners had founded their two republics, Transvaal or the South African Republic and the Orange Free State, the British ideally would want to amalgamate all those spaces under their territory. And seeing that the Dutch had been weakened by this fight with the Pedi, the British actually end up annexing the Transvaal or the South African Republic between 1877 and 1881. Surprisingly, even though the Boers were almost bankrupt, they were able to get it together and eventually were able to quote unquote, defeat the British and have them reeling back on their amalgamation colonial project. So again, South African Republic is quote unquote independent due to the guerrillas' Boer tactics, which sets them up perfectly for the next discovery. In 1886, if the discovery of diamonds at Kimberley had been seismic, the discovery of gold in Gauteng at Witwatersrand, right, just outside of Pretoria, which was the capital, the Boer capital, the Afrikaner capital of the South African Republic, named after one of the leaders of the Great Trek, Andreas Pretorius, right? So in all this, what I'm saying is, when this gold is discovered just in the heartland, right by the capital city, is different now from this contested region that Kimberley was. This is now in the heart of the Afrikaner nation, and the game changes entirely. How big is this? We can trace the birth of Johannesburg, which is one of the global metropolises today, to that discovery of gold in 1886 in this place. The city, the province itself, Gauteng, that means the place of gold. Johannesburg is often called Egoli, again, the place of gold. So important. But bigger than that, if we thought that Kimberley had brought with it an influx of immigration and contested land issues, this is that exponentially so, right? One of the conflicts that this immediately presents is the Boers, or the Afrikaners, who had been almost bankrupted by the war with the Pedi, who had just withstood occupation by the British, right, annexation by the British, and were independent, but they were not doing very well. They were not entirely stable, right? And they are not developed technologically. They are more people of the land. They are called the Boers, quite literally, right? And the British can't just annex this territory now. They've already tried and they lost, right? But they have all the technology, the industrial technology, to really get this mine thing going. So they come up with this plan with the Afrikaners, where the British would be the miners, their technology. They would run the mines. They would essentially own the mines, as long as they paid taxes to the hefty taxes to the Afrikaners, right? Which allowed them to revive their own community, their own republics, which had been struggling as a result of the conflict with the Pedis and the British. So they're able to do that. But also, because these guys are farmers, there's an influx of Europeans coming to mine, but also a lot of Africans who are coming in. By the way, the Africans, when they would come into work in these mines, their role was strictly limited to working underground. They did not have the potential to be promoted in the same way that the entry-level, white miner who would be here would. So within a generation or two, the gap, not even a generation, within a few years or two, the gap between two employees, one black, one white, who came in at the same time, is, the gap starts to widen right away as you climb up into managerial and supervisory positions that are not available to the black populace, right? So this schism is being created. But those farmers, right, the Boers are farmers. If they are not in the mines themselves, just benefiting off of the taxes from the British who are running this, what they now can do is farm, right, and provide food for the sudden influx of immigrants to the area, and they actually start to their economy begins to improve as a result of that, right? So again, although they were not directly involved in the gold mining process, their government, this government, benefited enormously. Charging heavy import duties on essential mining equipment, selling their farming. In fact, they were actually able to establish a standing army as a result of the money they were making from here. And they used that to go and claim further land from other African groups, right? So by 1898, the Boers had reconquered different territory from the Venda who had fought to preserve their own territory. So, and the British themselves were not just focused on mining either; they were also claiming more territory. Consider, for example, this, and I'm quoting here directly, this paragraph from the Shillington book. The last resistance of the century for the British came from the southern Tswana following the outbreak of rinderpest, which threatened to decimate the remnants of their economic independence. White settler colonies, eager for further African land, did not wait for rebellion. Rather, they actively sought it out, driving those who resisted into the remote Landsberg range of mountains near the southern edge of the Kalahari Desert. After a 6-month siege, the defenders were defeated by starvation and a fresh 2,000-strong colonial force. Their heroic leader, Kosi Luka Lyanti, died in the final shootout. His body was mutilated for colonial souvenirs, while his people were ethnically cleansed from the region, their land confiscated for sale to white settlers, and the several thousand transported to the southwestern Cape to serve as indentured laborers. And that last part is pretty fascinating because the British had outlawed slavery, right, to in the early 1800s. But by now that they are further inland, they are sending these thousands of people to work as indentured servants back to the southwestern Cape where they had first outlawed slavery. So while that's happening, the British, because colonizers are gonna colonize, right, are not satisfied though paying all these taxes and just being under the control of the Afrikaners in the South African Republic where the gold mines are. Plus, the Dutch, the Boers are already paranoid and skeptical of the British, right? Who they call Witlanders, outsiders. Long story long, by the 1890s, Cecil John Rhodes has ascended to become the prime minister of the Cape Colony, as it because were. He particularly hates this arrangement. He organizes a coup, right, to overthrow the Paul Kruger government, which was the South African Republic, the Afrikaner government, in 1895. That falls through, and in 1896 it actually forces Cecil John Rhodes to resign after this had failed. But this only further exacerbates the tensions. And in 1899, a full-on war, the Second Anglo-Boer War, the Second South African War begins between the Dutch and the British settlers, ending in 1902. The British clear winners. There's also a crazy legacy here of it being quite possibly the first time we see the use of concentration camps in the 20th century, something that would become more synonymous with with things like Hitler and beyond. But the first time we see concentration camps was with the Afrikaners who had lost this, which further fuels their anti-British nationalism, as it were. But of course, when the British and the Dutch were fighting the Anglo-Boer Wars, this was supposed to leave the Africans out. But of course, it never plays out that way, right? One, almost all these Europeans and Africans as servants and so forth. So that means those guys would be roped into the war. Two, while folks are busy fighting the mining on the ground and the farming and so forth, the resources are still being provided by black labor by and large in these spaces, so they're involved in that way as well. And of course, a lot of the fighting involves scorched earth tactics. So if you're using scorched earth tactics as a military tactic, it will destroy the parts of it that may not have anything to do with with the combatants, right? Plus, a lot of the Africans also just ended up in the concentration camps as well. So, that's how we get into the 20th century, and we're getting closer now to the modern day. The war ends, right? And in a nutshell, in 1910, the Dutch and the British decide to find a peace, and they come together and found what was then called the Union of South Africa, a new nation that pretty much the contemporary borders of South Africa now come into existence in 1910 with the Union of South Africa, which brought an official end to the Anglo-Boer Wars and unified the Dutch and the British settlers, right? So the Afrikaners and the British as the Union of South Africa. So, as the war, the Anglo-Boer War, was running down in 1902, the treaty that ended it is known as the Treaty of Vereeniging, right? The peace treaty known as the Treaty of... Hey, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, so to my 1.5 Boer Afrikaner speakers, holler at me. Indeed. But in any case, this ends and this begins the negotiations on how, how the British and the Boers were gonna work together going forward. What were the provisions of this treaty, right? The Boer republics became British colonies. The Boers accepted British sovereignty. The British had won. General amnesty was declared. The Boers were going to disarm and so forth. So pretty much just subjugation right there to swear allegiance to the British crown, right, as winners do. So that's the first stage, right? This is in 1902. In 1910, they would finally unify, as we've already mentioned. But other things were still afoot. A lot of what happens in 1910 and even afterwards is put in motion before that. For example, there's the South Africa Act of 1909, which finalized the drafting of laws for the Union of South Africa, such as language policy, right, and the denial of franchise to black South Africans, as well as the eventual formation of the Union of South Africa. This is all happening in 1909, right? So this act passes, right, denying franchise to black South Africans being the biggest concern at the time. The passing of this act, however, right, still faced a lot of opposition from the likes of J.T. Jabavu, who actually traveled to England where this thing was being drawn up. As well. But by 1909, the British, going back to the treaty, the British had, for the most part, given up on trying to influence governance in South Africa as long as South Africa swore allegiance to the crown. We're not going to mess with you, just swear allegiance to us, right? And such would be the status of Britain until at least from 1910 to 1961, when they became a republic. And then they finally left. Apartheid South Africa at the time left the British Commonwealth, as it were, then rejoined it after independence, after democracy in 1994. So that's the path that this took. But in any case, there were some groups that were protesting, right? The likes of Jabavu, who were protesting some of these provisions of the draft laws, but they were largely rebuffed. And on 31 May 1910, oh, by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't say this as a scholar, that going forward, I've drawn a lot of my materials here from the South African History Online page, website, as well as the South African government website, as well as other insights that I've, but those are the two main ones that influence this section of the reading. On the 31st of May 1910, 8 years after that treaty, South Africa became a union. Now, despite the mistrust in the Boer camp, among the Afrikaners, that mistrust that had gotten us to the war in the first place, they had negotiated and achieved self-determination, right? They had, gotten some self-determination under British rule, of course. Politically, it was nothing short of a miracle that the British and the Boers were able to unite and form this Union of South Africa, right? Despite the hatred and damage that the two Anglo-Boer Wars, right, the first one in 1879 and this one, the last one that ended in 1902, had inflicted on the country. In all this, however, they still ignored the wishes of the majority of the population. But by so doing, the formation of the Union of South Africa contributed to the political upheaval and turmoil that would pretty much define the country for the next century or so. And how did black people... So what has happened here? I don't know if you caught this. The British and the Dutch have designated themselves the citizens of the Union of South Africa, and with black people who are the majority, 80% plus, with them stripped of franchise, right? They are essentially not citizens of South Africa, of this Union of South Africa that only the Dutch and the British are full citizens of, with colored and Indian people slightly lesser citizens of. By the time we get to the black people, they are not citizens at all, right? So the response of the African press to the formation of this union was, they didn't like it at all. So this is where a lot of the leadership, the black leadership in South Africa, wrote letters talking about changing the draft act of the South African Union. But despite all efforts, this went through, of course, as we know. In response, J.T. Jabavu convened the Cape Native Convention, right, brought together different black leaders. The principal objection of this convention was that Britain would no longer be able to intervene on behalf of the native people, and that the relationship between them and the crown would be broken. Think about that. For a long time, the British settlers have almost stood as a bulwark to the excesses of the Afrikaners, who treat the black people, the Africans, very, very poorly. And now they turn around and they say, hey, we and the Dutch are friends now. We and the Boers are friends now. You guys are on your own. This was part of the treaty that, we are buddies now. So the Union of South Africa is formed in 1910, and so it goes, right? And immediately, if you thought that was the worst of it, the stripping of the franchise and this being relegated into or into lower class citizenship, if at all, was the worst part of it. Wait until you hear how it starts to manifest. Beginning in 1911, right away, preliminary drafts of the government's Native Lands Acts were debated that year. Soon come. But actually, the Mine and Works Act was passed in 1911. Now, this is a game changer, in mining. If the mineral revolution had made South Africa the modern nation that it is, the Mine and Works Act of 1911 oh my God, is defined here as a South African law that gave white workers a monopoly of skilled mining jobs. It was also known as the Color Bar Act. What the act did is it gave the Governor General the power to grant, cancel, and suspend certificates for mine managers, engineers, and miners. Right? So that's what it's doing. What it actually did, though, in practice, was the act ensured that white workers were paid more than black workers for the same work. And around the same time, the Native Labor Regulation Act of 1911 made it a crime for Africans to break a labor contract. Right, so this is all foreshadowing. You can see where this is going. And in 1913, we'll be getting the Native Lands Act. Hold on, be patient, baby. As a result of that, though, the black leaders... So in 1912, the group came together and formed the South African Native National Congress, right, in Bloemfontein, which was later renamed the African National Congress in 1923. It's the party that's still in power right now, sort of barely hanging in there. But that movement was formed, the first proper nationalist organization, African nationalist organization is found. And that's the ANC. But no sooner had the ANC been formed in 1912, right? We now get to this dreaded Natives Land Act of, Act number 27 of 1913. So, this Native Lands Act, passed on 19 June 1913, had a profound effect on the African population across the country. It also laid down the foundation for other legislation with which further entrenched dispossession of African people and segregation later of the colored people and the Indian people. The Act, there's the meat and potatoes, defined a native, quote unquote, as any person, male or female, who is a member of an aboriginal race or tribe of Africa, and shall further include any company or other body of persons, corporate or unincorporate, if the persons who have controlling interest therein are natives. Evidently, as you would expect, this affected millions of Africans. The Act's most catastrophic provision for Africans was the prohibition from buying or hiring land in 93% of South Africa. Right? In essence, Africans, despite being more in number, were confined, and this is putting it lightly, right? This is putting it very lightly. 10 times plus more Africans, right? Were confined to ownership of 7% of South Africa's land. This was later increased to 13.5%. Ooh, big jump. By the Native and Lands Trust Act, which was passed in 1936. Section 1, subsection A of the 1930 Native Lands Act states, "A native shall not enter into any agreement or transaction for the purchase, hire, or other acquisition from a person other than a native, of any such land or of any right thereto, interest therein, or servitude thereover." However, Africans were obviously permitted to buy and sell land in reserves or scheduled areas, right? Among each other, while whites were prohibited from owning land in these places, as the Act stated. "A person other than a native shall not enter into an agreement or transaction for the purchase, hire, or other acquisition from a native of any such land or any right thereto, interest therein, or servitude thereover." So when you hear this, it almost seems like, oh, good for the goose and good for the gander. Well, no, right? Because it's only 7%. But wait until we get to talking about the quality of the land, though. But we'll get to that shortly. The Act also included anti-squatting provisions to stop sharecropping, and also defined the boundaries of reserves, which were referred to as scheduled areas. The reserves. Maruzeva, shout out to Zims. And later on, this will be the basis of what we call the Bantustans. Loosely defined, as a squatter was a native tenant who paid for his tenancy using money or sharing part of his produce with the farmer. Consequently, the effect of the Land Act was to eliminate black tenants and to replace them in white areas by black servants or laborers who would no longer be allowed to lease land in white areas. So you see the machinations here. Scholar Marlene Flemmer has pointed out that the Act was passed to alleviate the problem of poor white farm laborers who were competing for employment in farms with black laborers, especially quote-unquote native tenant farmers. So pressure to introduce such legislation came more especially from the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, where the aforementioned issue was a problem. And again, not to get too Marxist about things, but this is again a quintessential, the ways in which race is used to further capital accumulation, right? And why race and class are very difficult to separate even to this day, because this is in the 20th century, right? This is 100 years ago. But the idea that while poor white people could have had something in common with poor black people, that was made sure to not be the case by the provision of such things as this and that Workers' Act, that meant that whites could would always work better jobs and get paid more, and that the upward mobility that black miners did not have. It is important to note here that the Land Act was passed before a decision had been made on which land was to be allocated or reserved for black people and which land was to be allocated to white people. Until this was resolved, right, the government maintained the status quo by prohibiting blacks from obtaining land outside the so-called scheduled areas, which we spoke about earlier. Thus, a clause in the Act, in the Native Lands Act, to establish a commission which would look into the issue of finding land for black and whites was an attempt by the government to implement this act. As a consequence, the Native Land Commission was established, right? Also known as the Beaumont Commission, established that same year. The commission was granted 2 years to accomplish its work and to submit a report which would then be used to demarcate land. It was tasked with investigating the availability of land and defining boundaries for permanent territorial segregation between black and white people. This was its purpose, 1913. The two basic questions it asked were, what areas within the Union of South Africa should lie set apart as areas which natives shall not be permitted to acquire or hire land or interest in land? What areas within the Union of South Africa should be set apart as areas within which persons other than natives shall not be permitted to acquire or hire land or interest in land? During the Commission's work, racial prejudice which presumed white people's superiority over black people became very evident. For example, this is great, the Commissioner notes the Europeans who lived in Kwelera Muyuplatz were sadly lacking in much that proved the superiority of white over the black. Subsequently, he recommended the area for native occupation because it was a poor soil with a steep and sour path. Only a K, I won't say the word, but it's the K word that is a slur for black people in racist South Africa, going back to the apartheid era and obviously before. With his only a K, with his limited requirements, should be expected to exist upon such terms. He adds that in assessing the area's suitability for settlement, he did not consult the natives in case they became aggressive and annoying to their European neighbors. This is from the report of the Land Commissioner, Appendix 8. So that's crazy, right? That even just the logic of this, and Paulo Freire writes about this, about what colonialism does with the colonizers' mind. We know what it does with the colonized people, but do we ever think about what it does with the colonized mind? Because think about this logic, right? That when you saw the Europeans, they were not doing well with the resources that they had. So that there was nothing to show that they were superior. So, you know what? Let's give the quote-unquote inferior people this worse land because only they can exist with these limited requirements could be expected to exist upon such terms. To me, that almost sounds backwards. Wouldn't the superior person be able to do more with less? Right? Right? And also this thing that they may become aggressive and annoy their European neighbors. Oh, sorry for the minor inconvenience of you just stealing our land and putting us in these scheduled areas, as it were. The nerve of these guys. So what impact did this Land Act have? And again, to emphasize that I'm citing heavily from the South African History Online site here and other sources. But perhaps the most visible impact of the Act was how it denied Africans access to land which they owned or had been leasing from the white farmers. The Act seized the very asset which was central to the lives of African people, virtually making them destitute in their own land, right? The Act also minimized competition by denying blacks the right to purchase land and opportunity to become shareholders on white-owned land. In essence, the Land Act marked the end of the limited independence which African farmers had on white-owned land. In spite of the Land Act, sharecropping and labor tendency continued. This was because the long delay in its implementation and because white landlords who wanted to keep sharecroppers or rent tenants found ways of getting around the law. Meanwhile, African farmers struggled to hold on to the land of their own, no matter how small the piece. Thus, the impact of the Land Act to black people was profound. It dispossessed and locked black people into servitude. And Sol Plaatje, right, the legendary ANC leader, would write, the section of the law debarring natives from hiring land is particularly harsh. It has been explained that its major portion is intended to reduce natives to serfs. Right, that's from his book Native Life in South Africa. Immediately after the passing of the Land Act, white farmers began issuing notices of eviction to black people. Oh, by the way, the little bit of land that they had, the 7%, not only did they have like 7%, which eventually became 13% of the land, despite being 85+% of the population, that land, if you remember, it was also selected to be the worst land, right? So they could not find enough fertile land to use for crops. Immediately after the passing of the Land Act, white farmers began issuing notice of eviction to black people. Right. By 1936, nearly half of the African workers in towns had migrated from white farms. So think about that social machination as well. That not only are the black people losing the land, right? They are now being forced into the cities where, surprise, surprise, the main industries, of course, are the white, whether it's mining or nascent industrialization in South Africa. They now have to work in those spaces, right? Or as maids or gardeners for the white people who live there. So it's the 20th century version of the Hottentot Code, right? That they're now being forced into this position where they've been dispossessed of their land and they now have to move to the cities where they'll be working for close to nothing, and that racial gap further exacerbates. African farmers who owned land inside and outside the reserves did not receive any aid from the government in the form of loans. They therefore found it increasingly difficult to compete with white farmers who could use improved methods and expand their farms. Lastly, the Act laid down the foundation for separate development through the development of... So eventually, when we get to the Apartheid era, you will talk about the Bantustans and the homeland, or the homelands, which are part of what we call Grand Apartheid. Now, how did people respond to these acts? Well, vociferously, if I may say. The Native Lands Act sparked opposition, particularly by black African people. You know, early on when the act was still in Parliament, John Dube, the president of the ANC, then known as the SANNC, published an article in the newspaper Ilanga Lase Natal called the article was titled "Wrong Policy." He criticized the Native Land Bill and stated that it was intended to keep Africans down, to tell them get out, futsek, to go back to your locations, or go back to work for your white masters. End quote. Now, the writing of the papers is indeed, other leaders, African leaders joined in by protesting in columns of newspapers. And this is in keeping with the moderate approach of the African leaders of the time, as I explained earlier. However, once it started to look like there was some motion towards it, right, and the act was passed on 25 July 1913, the SANNC decided to proceed and send a delegation, fundraise and send a delegation to protest this to the Crown, to the British Crown in London. And on February 14, 1914, so Valentine's Day, 5 leaders of the community of the SANNC landed in London to have a conversation with the Crown, but they were rebuffed, and the British government decided not to intervene, and consequently the Land Act was not reversed. So, the British, with what authority could they do this, right? They are in peak colonialist at the time as well. So Plaki, one of the ANC leaders, published the book Native Life in South Africa as a protest against the Land Act. The passing of the act also ignited a protest march by Mahatma Gandhi, right? In addition, the African People's Organization, that was Dr. Abdul Rahman's organization, the APO, also spoke strongly against the Land Act. So a lot of people were protesting this right away. And as before we move on to seeing how this plays out throughout the 20th century, here's a conclusion written by, a statement made by scholar A.J. Christopher, who says the Native Land Act was officially conceived as a first stage in drawing a permanent line between Africans and non-Africans, end quote. In essence, the Land Act became a critical edifice in the construction of a racially and spatially divided South Africa. Subsequent acts such as the Urban Areas Act of 1923, the Native and Land Trust Act of 1936, and the Group Areas Act of 1950 reinforced the land dispossession and segregation in South Africa. And now, as I get to talking about how that played out in the 20th century, right up until apartheid begins in 1948 to the end in 1994 and beyond, established. So I will run through the apartheid era dynamics real quickly before we get to our conclusion today. Indeed. Now, I can already hear some of you saying to me, Shingi, you've spent so long describing how we got to the early 1900s. How are you going to speed through the most relevant part of it, right? The 20th century and the apartheid era and so forth. And there's a very simple reason for that, right? For all the laws and the escalations, we don't find ourselves in too different a place in regards to land ownership when we get to 1994. Let's look at some of the acts that came in after 1913, as it were, right? Shall we? Just a few. So after the Land Act, South Africa's legal framework systematically entrenched racial segregation in land ownership and space planning. Here are some of those critical laws. So we spoke about that one in 1913, which gave 7% to the black people. The Native Trust and Land Act, which we've mentioned already, expanded the land designated for black people from 7% to 13%, but still kept the vast majority of land under white control. Right. And, to further punctuate that bit of quote-unquote progress, they created the South African Native Trust to manage black holdings, right? So even that wasn't just given to them. It came with an asterisk, right? Later on, we get what we call the Group Areas Act. This is after apartheid has kicked in 1948. So this Group Areas Act of 1950, 1957, this codified racial segregation in residential, business, and agricultural land, and forced the mass eviction of black, Indian, and colored communities from areas that were deemed white. And this is where you see the creation of areas like District 6 in Cape Town and Sophia, right? Say Sophia. South Africa, let me know. Sophia Town in Johannesburg. So a lot of people were forcibly relocated to townships and far from economic centers. This is why you see the ghettos of South Africa, right? In 1951, something seismic shows up, and that's the Bantu Authorities Act, which created the framework for the Bantustans, or homeland system, which I've spoken about, which stripped black South Africans of their South African citizenship, stripped it all together and assigned them to ethnic homelands. So these are like, if that 7% and 13% were called reserves, this is more a codified version of that, which because this centralized political control under tribal chiefs appointed by the apartheid government, weakening local resistance. So what this looked like was to say that, are you Zulu? Are you Pedi? Are you Xhosa? Whatever your ethnicity was. Even if it was an ethnicity there, even if you had lived in the urban areas for the past 60, 70 years, even if you had lived somewhere else, right? As one may do in a free country. But now you are confined to Zululand as a Zulu person, right? Under a tribal chief. And oftentimes the tribal chiefs, that's sort of just an honorarium. They were chosen on account of being, they're appointed by the apartheid government. So a lot of them would be playing ball with the government, which weakened local resistance. So you have things like Chief Buthelezi of Zululand. You have Mangope of Boputa Tswana. These are folks who were, to say apartheid stooges, some version of an apartheid puppet at the time, right? So this is But the Bantustans are definitely further codified this. In 1951, the same year, we get the Prevention of Illegal Squatting Act, which criminalized informal settlements for public and private land, allowed authorities to demolish shacks and informal housing, right? Forced mass removal. Then as time went on, we start to see some laws that are more favorable to black, but this is because by now, due to protests, which I'll talk about shortly after this, due to protests to apartheid, the vigor, by the time we get to the late 70s and early 80s, the protests, the activism against it, plus also just the waning specter of the Cold War, which has been a big deal up until this point, and has been a large part of why the West has continued to support South Africa even as it's run a rabid racist society under apartheid. It's starting to wane a little bit, right? So you start to see some of these laws like the 99-year leasehold system put in place in 1978 under Prime Minister P.W. Botha, who allowed black South Africans in urban areas to lease land for 99 years. Not own it, but lease it, right? So it was seen as a weak attempt to address this land inequality while maintaining apartheid-era restrictions. Then in 1986, we see the abolition of Influx Control Act, which repealed the past laws that had been a defining feature of apartheid, and I'll talk about the past laws shortly here. And this is really, we're starting to see the peeling away of apartheid. But this came too late to reverse decades of forced removals and displacement. So what does this mean? By the time apartheid ended, guess how much had changed? Guess how much land the white minority owned? 87%. The same number as from the 1936 Act, which increased it from 7 to 13%. 94, right? 94. So this is very well within our lifetime, right? And not even our old lifetime, like 70s or 60s, with all due respect. Shout out to my elders. But we're talking about younger people here. Despite black South Africans making up the majority of the population. So the legacy of these laws still shapes these struggles. So was there any resistance to this from black people? Or from anti-apartheid activists? Of course there were. We start to see apartheid comes into place in 1948. Early on, we see the ANC Youth League, right, depart from the more conservative, moderate approach of its predecessors, the likes of Reverend John Dube. And now I'm talking about the era of the Sisulus and Mandelas and Tambo, to name a few. There's a little more energy in wanting to fight, because they are seeing that not only are they living in a racist society, it seems like the laws are becoming more and more codified as apartheid has taken a hold. And by the way, there's anti-pass law marches happening. A prominent moment happens in 1955 when the ANC and other organizations, including the Natal Indian Congress, the South African Communist Party, different organizations representing women representing other minority groups, came together in what was known as the Freedom Congress. And they came together at this gathering in 1955, met in Johannesburg, and produced what they were proposing as a manifesto, like a pamphlet, right? Or what would be the basis of a constitution for a free and fair and democratic South Africa. And it began with the claim, South Africa belongs to all those who belong in it, black or white and so forth. In one hand, this is an attempt at making peace with not peace per se, but finding common ground or appealing moderately to the sensibilities of the apartheid regime, right? It's already flawed because, yeah, sure, you can say that South Africa belongs to all those who live in it, right? But that's not the issue at play here. The issue at play is a very small group of that has taken virtually all the land, and that's what the fight is. So sure, you can make this bigger proclamation, and If it sounds like other proclamations that we've heard in more recent times, that's what that is. Now, right away, that really upset some more radical members, particularly of ANC, who then split away, saying that this had been some pseudo-Marxist ploy to dampen the resistance. And they split away from that and they said, no, South Africa doesn't belong to all those who live in it. It belongs to us. We are the real... we can share this with you, right? Or we can do some business in which you have some of the land. But to say it belongs to all of us makes our being robbed of the land the sting of that sound to be less severe. But this is actually our land. So as a result of that, they actually break away and form their own organization called the Pan-African Congress. And I had the good fortune of speaking with some of them in about 6-7 years ago. Fantastic insights. But one of the things that they believed to this day that their call is, when you say Africa Elise Gwelet, then you say in response Elise Gwelet to Africa, which is to say Africa is our land. Then they respond, and our land is Africa. Anymore, right? And that group, the PAC, ended up energizing, reinvigorating, as it were, the resistance movement, and culminated in 1960s March on Sharpeville, right? Seminal moment that brought a lot of global eyes to the apartheid regime, where with the PAC sort of taking the lead, but also the ANC realizing this is a very important moment in history and them getting involved in that as well, leading a march on Sharpeville, an anti-pass laws march. They told everybody to leave their passes behind as a way to overwhelm the system. There's no way the cops are going to arrest all of them, but as fate would have it, because colonizers are going to do these things, the apartheid authorities end up mowing down people, and 69 people died and hundreds of others were injured as a result of what became known as the Sharpeville massacre. This was also the early days of television being broadcast internationally, so these images were seen around the world and really marked a turning point for global perceptions about the terrors of apartheid, while internally the apartheid regime continued to double down. And we've spoken about all the acts that they put in place. So in the aftermath of all that, long story long, the political parties are banned. Mandela and his peers are locked up. The likes of Steve Biko rise to the fore as sort of student leaders who are very influential. But the land issue continues to be a big factor even throughout that, which is why by 78 you get that Lease Act and other acts going into the 1980s. But it's also important to remember that some of the legacies of this moment, for example, when you hear Julius Malema of the EFF singing that what's the song he sings about killing Amabunu, right? Mabunu being the Africanized term for the Boers, right? This is a wartime song. This is an apartheid era song in which they used to say, get rid of the Boers, kill the Boer. That's essentially how the song translates to. That has re-emerged as the EFF, who I'll talk about shortly when I get to talking about some of the resistance movements post-apartheid, or advocacy groups post-apartheid. This song is one of the controversial songs that somebody like an Elon Musk or whoever is being sensationalist about, but the situation in South Africa might point to and say, look at what those guys are doing. Barbarians, right? So these are some of the legacies of the land issue in South Africa. And again, as we really get to rounding up here, I will talk briefly about what some moves that have been made in post-apartheid South Africa have been surrounding the land issue, and we will then talk about why there's been this reaction from the White House and what it means going forward. Indeed. So, what has South Africa done since the end of apartheid to remedy this historical wrong, right? This historical injustice. Well, so several reform programs have been put in place, largely the land reform program aimed at redistributing this land as manifest in three key pillars, and we'll talk about some of those examples. So the three are restitution, which is returning land to dispossessed communities, redistribution, right, transferring land to black South Africans to improve equity, then tenure reform, which is securing land rights for people living in communal or leased land. So this is the larger land reform program, and some of the tenets of it have been things like the Restitution of Land Rights Act of 1994, which was later reformed in 2014. And this allowed individuals and communities that were dispossessed in 1913 to claim their ancestral land or receive some form of compensation. So we've had a few landmark cases around that, such as the Richtersveld case, in which the Constitutional Court ruled that the Nama people were entitled to restitution for land lost due to the colonial era dispossession that's in northern South Africa. A prominent method through which this has been done is the willing buyer, willing seller policy, which is a market-driven approach, right? And the name is exactly as it suggests, where the government bought land from willing white farmers to redistribute. Indeed, and we will evaluate those and a few others, right? Culminating recently in the debates around expropriation without compensation debate, where the ANC and the economic freedom fighters, as led by Julius Malema, have pushed for constitutional amendments that allow land expropriation without paying, not which is meant to bypass things like the willing buyer, willing seller, which in many cases the sellers were not willing. But however, a 2021 parliamentary vote failed to pass the required 2/3 majority for the amendment, because this would really be upsetting the apple cart, and in many ways would give some sort of credence to the allegations as leveled by Trump and Musk, as well as maybe playing to the fears of another Zimbabwe, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, most recently, a new expropriation bill was put in place, right, beginning in 2023, but signed into law in January 2025 by President Ramaphosa, in which he signed the Expropriation Act of 2024 into law, which is meant to address this historical disparities by empowering the government to expropriate land without compensation, particularly abandoned or unused land, right? So the act, as it reads, empowers the government to expropriate property for a public purpose or in the public interest. And this is focused on land that is either abandoned land, state-owned land that is not in use, land held purely for speculative purposes, and land posing health, safety, or environmental risks due to neglect. And the process here was outlined. So it was this act signed in January that the Trump administration was responding to in particular. Now, the motivations for it are there's a few theories, which is how I will conclude this video. But it is to this very moment that the Trump administration was responding, the signing of the expropriation bill by President Ramaphosa, right? So, given all these acts, and we'll talk about that response shortly here, but given all these things we spoke about, and that's just a few of them that I spoke about, right? We didn't even talk about the fact that a land claims court was introduced in 1996, the Communal Land Rights Act of 2004, all these things. So, where has that gotten us? Well, despite all these efforts, land redistribution remains slow. So, as of recent estimates, South Africa has redistributed about 10 to 11% of commercial farmland to black ownership since 1994, right? The government has bought more land than that, but has struggled with effective redistribution. So given that white farmers control that 87% of agricultural land at the end of apartheid, the slow pace of redistribution has fueled frustrations and calls for more radical land reform policies. Right. So what are these challenges that it has faced? Some of you guys can probably piece it together already. But number one, a large vehicle for this redistribution was the willing buyer, willing seller model. Right? Which again, you have to volunteer to sell it, and the buyer has to be willing as well. Well, straight up, many white landowners either refused to sell or set high prices, which were prohibitive, which the government struggled to afford, which made distribution expensive and slow. Then also there's bureaucratic inefficiencies, which you may expect. Indeed. In light of this, right, several different groups have emerged as players that are either pushing for land redistribution at different levels of radicalism, and some who are defending it, who are defending the status quo, as it were. So among the pro-land reform groups are, of course, the ruling party, African National Congress, but as a ruling party and as true to the nature of the ANC, it's a what we call a broad church. So there's different perceptions there, and they're never gonna be like many ruling parties. They're never gonna go all the way. So some people are pushing for radical land seizures, and others favor more gradual reforms. A large sort of battery in the back of this machine has been the economic freedom fighters founded by Julius Malema, who was himself the leader of the ANC Youth League once upon a time. Remember we spoke about how the ANC Youth League emerged back in the 1940s and was more radical. So this was in following with that tradition. And just like many members of the Youth League ended up splitting back in the day and founding the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, this was a similar move in which Julius Malema founded the Economic Freedom Fighters, a far more left-wing organization, the EFF, in 2013. This advocates for mass land expropriation, without compensation, and state custodianship of all land, right? Very left-leaning idea. It's also that group that is famous for the Kill the Boer song that we spoke about earlier. Indeed. But other movements have also risen away from that. There's a Landless People Movement, which is a grassroots organization founded in 2000. Alright, just speaking for the landless people, you have groups like Association for Rural Advancement. Later on, there was a group called Black First, Land First, which was a radical black nationalist organization that lasted from 2015 to 2019. This one was probably the most radical, that was calling for more militant, immediate land expropriation without compensation, the end of private land ownership. So again, if you thought the EFF was radical, this one was even more radical. And it lasted until 2019 before it was banned as a political party, and eventually just sort of faded from relevance, as it were. Indeed, groups that have been pro the status quo include the major opposition party. So if the EFF is maybe like the third political party, the Democratic Alliance is the major sort of liberal party in South Africa, which promotes a market-driven land reform. It opposes the expropriation without compensation, right? Arguing it would hurt investment and food security. Then advocates for private ownership rights, long-term leasing models, and support for black farmers. So very centrist in their approach. But then you have Agri-SA, right? Agricultural South Africa, which is a farmers association representing mostly white farmers. It supports land reform. This is a more moderate one, but opposes forced expropriation, calling for state support for new black farmers, right? Indeed. Then AfriForum and Solidarity Movement, that's when we are getting further to the far right wing, where AfriForum strongly opposes land expropriation without compensation, calling it a threat to minority rights. So this is a group that is speaking in the voice of Trump And Solidarity Movement is another one. This is a white Afrikaner-led labor and civil rights organization which argues that land reform should be voluntary and economically sustainable, right? So AfriForum is probably the far right wing here, but indeed there's several groups that are also speaking for more or calling for some version of a tempered approach to this. Okay. Now let's talk about the immediate sequence of events that got us here. As I mentioned earlier, in January 2025, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, shout out Cyril, signed the Expropriation Act of 2024 into law, right? That's that act that was meant to expropriate without compensation under specific circumstances, such as abandoned land, state-owned land not in use, land held purely for speculative purposes, that whole jazz, right? And the process for that would be notice and consultation, a determination of compensation, where the compensation is negotiated between the state and the property owner. If an agreement isn't reached, the matter can be referred to the courts or for a decision, then possession and transfer, right? So there have been reactions across the board. Domestic reactions, primarily, and we'll talk about some of those a bit later. Critics argue that expropriation without compensation could undermine property rights, deter investment, and negatively impact the economy. Right. But the supporters contend it's a necessary step to rectify the historical injustice. So basically, with Zimbabwe as a cautionary tale, I've previously made a video about the Zimbabwean land issue, so I'll put a link in the description. Indeed, but of course the loudest voice that came out of this was President Trump. Key actions that they took was, number one, Trump signed an executive order halting all U.S. aid to South Africa, citing concerns over the Land Expropriation Act and its potential impact on property rights. And following up to that, American Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced he would not attend the G20 foreign ministers meeting in Johannesburg, criticizing South Africa's policies as anti-American. And now that we're speaking about them more broadly, we'll see what we mean by that. That it's more than just the land issue here that the US cares about. They're not just being the good guys. There's very vested interest in as well. Then also discussions emerged about potentially terminating the African Growth and Opportunities Act, a trade deal that benefits South African agricultural exports. Such a move could adversely affect sectors like citrus and wine, which rely heavily on tariff-free access to the US market. In addition to this, Trump also signed an executive order offering refugee status and resettlement in the US to South Africa's white Afrikaner farmers. Think about that, right? In an era where the US is severely cutting down on immigration and all these things, right? That then is offering refugee status and resettlement in the US to South Africa's white Afrikaner farmers, citing concerns over alleged racial discrimination, right? Again, with a battery powered by Elon Musk's comments, and land expropriation without compensation. However, and this is a funny part right here, Afrikaner organizations have declined this offer, expressing a commitment to remain in South Africa, such as AfriForum, that far-right group that I spoke about, reiterated their intention to stay and work towards a prosperous future in South Africa. They acknowledged existing issues but rejected the notion of seeking refuge elsewhere. Solidarity Movement, which was not as far-right, emphasized that Afrikaners are dedicated to building their future within South Africa. They highlighted that despite challenges, the Afrikaner community remains among the most economically privileged in the country. In fact, there was a TikTok trend in which white South Africans were pretty much doing a first world problems about their persecution in South Africa, right? Because, again, there really is very little justifiable basis for these claims. Indeed. We will finish off this segment by talking about why the US is acting in this way and what the reality on the ground actually is. So there are two things that we want to evaluate the claims that got us here. To reread Trump's tweet, right? South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. It is a bad situation that the radical left media doesn't want to so much as mention. Yeah, that's kind of his own thing with the media. And Elon Musk saying you have openly racist ownership laws. And we saw the earlier claim from 2018 in which he said, I've asked Secretary of State to closely study South Africa land and farm seizures and the expropriation and the large-scale killing of farmers. So we want to evaluate the land thing, then the large-scale killing, the white genocide claims as they've been leveled. Indeed. So, what's up with the land? Right? Well, remember, white South Africans, who make up about 7 to 8% of the population right now, own roughly 72% of privately owned farmland. I may have been saying 75%. I do apologize. Charge that to, this video is running long. So anyway, 72%. Down from 87% in 1936 all the way to 1994. So down by 15%. That is hardly any change. Those numbers, the fact that they still look like apartheid, also speak to South Africa's rampant inequality, which is its defining quality among others right now. For example, let me read this bit here from this paper by scholar Matthew McKeever called Social Stratification and Inequality in South Africa. And I'll just read a part here. And I quote, by almost any standard measure, inequality in South Africa is extreme. The GNI coefficient for European countries runs from 0.25 to 0.35, is 0.41 for the US, and 0.58 in sub-Saharan Africa overall. For South Africa, that GNI coefficient, which is what measures inequality, is 0.63, so far above the average in just sub-Saharan Africa and way above European countries, which with South Africa's status as a middle-income nation, it really should be aspiring for more things like that. Wealth inequality is similarly extreme. The top 10% hold anywhere from 71 to 85% of the total wealth, while the bottom 50% of the population holds only 4% to 7% of the wealth. So South Africa has a huge inequality problem, and it falls largely on the poor black people of South Africa. Indeed, the victims of inequality in South Africa are not the white South Africans. Let's just put that out there. That is not what's happening. This is a manufactured reality. And as to the claim of violence, white genocide, large-scale killings of farmers, as we saw earlier, right? For example, in the last documented year that I have here, in 2023, 49 white farmers were killed, right? And that is very unfortunate and terrible and should not be happening. However, what South Africa actually has is not a target, because that number was 0.18% of the people murdered in South Africa that year. 23, the same year that those 49 white farmers were killed that year, there was a total of 27,368 murders in South Africa, averaging approximately 75 per day. So in that 1 year, this population that makes up between 7.8% constituted 0.18% of the murders, and the 49 white farmers that were killed that year are less than the daily average. So this murder rate is 75 per day, people getting killed in South Africa. South Africa has a murder problem, has a violent crime problem, and that's just not conjecture, right? according to the World Population Review, which I have the stats up here, South Africa is in the top 10 of countries with the highest homicide rates, right? Surprisingly, just it and Lesotho, which is dang near just South Africa, are the only two non-Caribbean nations on this list. Well, and Honduras. So that's very fascinating. So South Africa definitely has a murder problem, has an inequality problem and a murder problem, none of which are disproportionately targeting white farmers or white South Africans. In fact, for a while, the dog whistles, right, maybe coming from places like AfriForum, that would speak to this, and in 2020 they put together a pathetic Boer Lives Matter protest. I'll share some of the pictures here, in which they had their black servants carrying the signs while they barbecue in the back. Indeed. And for a while, there were these dog whistle things where anybody who got killed, any of the white farmers who got killed, it was immediately framed as one of these things. Yet when you look at it, right, several cases, as I'm showing on the screen right now, were issues of domestic violence time and again, right? Again, this may be anecdotal, but this is to say that there's been this fervor to insinuate or to create this narrative of white genocide in South Africa and things just being unfair, right? So why is this happening, and why is the Trump administration particularly acrimonious to South Africa over these claims that are very much unjustified? So I thought long and hard about how to order these factors in a way that, on one hand, makes intuitive sense to follow. That is, what represents a separate point, what falls under the same umbrella, etc. And on the other, doesn't overinflate the importance of one particular dynamic in a way that makes the excitable troll, immediately go, aha, that can be a real thing. So follow along here. The first set of factors I'll call the Cold War hangover. Right? Throughout the second half of the 20th century, the Western world in general, and the US in particular, maintained a well-documented love affair with the white apartheid regime of South Africa. Indeed, even through the Freedom Charter, through the Sharpeville massacres, through the Rivonia trial and Mandela and his friends all going away to Robben Island, through Soweto in 1976, the death of Biko after that, Paul Simon singing with Ladysmith Black Mambazo in the 80s, right? Through all that, through international protest, the US and the rest of the Western world, not the rest of it, but definitely at least the UK, and this is most readily embodied by the Reagan administration and the Margaret Thatcher administration, which are often spoken of in tandem as a nexus of Western conservatism in the 1980s. Reagan's administration adopted a policy called constructive engagement towards South Africa during the apartheid era. And in line with this policy, the Reagan administration lifted certain restrictions on exporting military equipment to South Africa, and often used its veto power to block punitive measures against the country in international forums. Reagan expressed support to the South African government, acknowledging the steps it had taken toward reform and the gains achieved. Right. They were nowhere close, but, tricameral legislation and so forth. However, Reagan's approach faced significant criticism both domestically and internationally. Critics argued that, quote-unquote, constructive engagement was insufficient to dismantle apartheid and that it effectively supported the apartheid regime. In 1986, despite Reagan's veto, the US Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which imposed sanctions on South Africa, signaling legislative pushback against this policy. So why would the US continue, why would the Reagan administration continue to support these guys? Well, a large part of it was the apartheid regime's unwavering commitment to capitalism and to being on that side of the Cold War, especially in an era when not only all its neighbors, right, whether it's Zimbabwe, in the 70s during the Chimurenga, Frelimo in Mozambique, MPLA in Angola. All these groups were receiving support from the Soviets or China or both or Cuba. You know, the red wave was definitely something that the U.S. was particularly concerned about, and in the spirit of containment, were holding on to their ally in the apartheid regime. That is to say, white America said, if you stand with us against these communists, we'll turn a blind eye to your little racist enterprise here. Alright? So the end of apartheid, however, did not mark the end of this preferential relationship. The negotiated settlement nature of South Africa's transition to democracy in 1994 meant to preserve white power structures, and in particular, capital, largely untouched. So while Mandela is wheeled out as a saint and the ANC wins the elections, the economic levers of the nation remain largely in apartheid hands. Though the Cold War is in the rear view, South Africa virtually became the neoliberal darling, and as long as their hands in charge of capital play ball, the rest of the world doesn't care about the poor masses, right? Right? Talk of redistributing the land by itself and by the larger shift it represents disrupts this status quo, right? It forces capital to change hands, especially when the loudest noise around it has come from toying leftists, the EFF, who, with their red berets, even resemble, right? It's reminiscent of the Cold War. Add to this, too, that Trump has styled himself as some form of Reagan regen, right? A Reagan 2.0. Now hear me out. If I said a Republican president who was noteworthy for their work in entertainment and in the socialite spaces before rising to power, who rag on and on about let's make America great again, and somehow endeared themselves to the evangelical base, and also talk super tough on foreign policy, even if sometimes it sounds like, what are we even talking about here, you know? Who am I describing? It could be Ronald or it could be Donald. Babe, even the names are similar, right? Indeed. So for DJT then, more than perhaps other presidents, doing right by the remnants of apartheid South Africa in the context of the woke left, calling for land redistribution in the shithole part of South Africa that is just the poor masses, that is in white capital, threatening their well-being, well, that's the Reagan thing to do. But also, speaking of a former ally, or rather client state gone rogue, there may be other geopolitical considerations irking the Trump administration as well here. His recent actions and statements regarding South Africa may be closely tied to his concerns about the BRICS alliance, which, if you are unaware, BRICS is the acronym for representing a coalition of emerging economies, the B for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And as of 2024, founded in 2009, but as of 2024, has expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates as well. And the purpose of it is to foster economic cooperation, reform international financial institutions, and challenge the dominance of Western nations in global affairs. Of late, then, Trump has expressed apprehension about these BRICS initiatives, particularly discussions of creating a common currency. He perceives such moves as potential threats to the US dollar's supremacy in international trade, and in response, Trump threatened to impose a 100% tariff on imports from BRICS nations if they proceeded with launching a common currency. So these actions suggest that President Trump's criticism of South Africa recently is not solely based on land reform issues, but also possibly because they are part of this they're a founding member of BRICS, and it seems again that a very good friend of the US is now stepping out of line and aligning themselves with the ops, Furthermore, South Africa has also upset the powers that be by being pretty vocal in their criticism of Israel's recent actions in Palestine. In December 2023, for example, South Africa filed a case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, accusing it of committing acts of genocide in the occupied Palestine territories, right? This legal action invoked the 1948 Genocide Convention, under which states can bring disputes concerning the responsibility of a state for genocide before the ICJ. Now, the US opposed South Africa's application, with officials describing the genocide accusation against Israel as meritless and counterproductive. So, all this to say, South Africa has been pretty vocal. And it's not a surprise, right? Because South Africa, in many ways, the situation that in Palestine is most often called an apartheid system, which is a term that is synonymous with South Africa at the time. So it's no surprise that the post-apartheid government would align itself with another apartheid inflicted group, right? Another group that has been victimized by a form of apartheid, indeed. So masses, right? And the poor masses who are protesting the post-colonial government that has pretty much preserved the colonial era status quo vis-a-vis land ownership, oftentimes with song and dance reminiscent of the anti-colonial fight 2 decades after the end of the colonial era. Again, what am I describing here? Am I describing South Africa? You betcha. But you know what else I described almost to a T? Zimbabwe, right? So, and I've made a video on Zimbabwe and the land reform there already. But here are the bits in South Africa that are reminiscent of Zimbabwe. The Southern African settler colony, when the colonial era in South Africa, the apartheid era ended, the transition to democracy, land reform was attempted by a process called the willing buyer, willing seller process, which we've already spoken about, which of course the sellers were not as willing. Colonial disparities largely unaddressed until 2 decades in. So in Zimbabwe, this starts to get going around the 97, going forward. In South Africa, again, you're seeing around 2013, 2014, conversations around land start to get louder and louder. The government beginning to feel pressure in Zimbabwe with the rise of the MDC, in South Africa with the rise of these different groups, including the EFF, but to the other side of that, the more liberal centrist group, the DA movement. If this people's uprising goes down, if they leave it to the people to rise up, at most benign, some very rich people will lose their land, which is not ideal because that's capital still changing power. However, potentially it would get violent, especially when done in desperation or as a means of placating the starving masses, as we saw in Zimbabwe, where that's where the land reform, that's where it earned its uglier reputation for violence. Indeed, this is not good. So the U.S. response to the Zimbabwe's land redistribution program, particularly the fast-track land reform in 2000, was largely critical, leading to diplomatic condemnation, economic sanctions, and humanitarian aid interventions, right? So the U.S. criticized the government land reform in Zimbabwe. I mean, I've done a whole video on this. I'll put it in the description with the nitty-gritties. But also economic sanctions such as ZIDERA, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, all come in the aftermath of this land reform. So as a result of this, before the land reform, around 2000, there were around maybe 200,000 white Zimbabweans living in Zimbabwe still. Right, it peaked around 300,000 in the 70s, but around 200,000 by the mid 2000s. And I was there at this point. I was in high school, and even just seeing the school that I went to shift from being about 50% or maybe a little more white kids in 2000 to the time when I graduated, it was maybe closer to like 20. Right, so even the numbers here reflect that this population that might have been around 200,000 in 2000 by mid 2000s was around 30,000 to 50,000. Now it's maybe between 10 and 20,000. So this indicates that about 75% to 90% of white Zimbabweans left Zimbabwe following the land reform. And there's that white thing again. Or if you think this has nothing to do with it, you got another thing coming, right? Going back right to the Reagan administration. And I will read here from a book titled From Colony to Superpower, U.S. Foreign Relations Since 1776 by George C. Herring. And I'll read a paragraph. I quote, "In Southern Africa, race and the Cold War defined U.S. policies. Reagan and his top advisors had little sympathy for black nationalism, linking the African National Congress with communism. Rather than challenge apartheid, they claimed to follow a policy of constructive engagement, but they said nothing when the South African government brutally cracked down on dissidents." So, again, even this, the idea of race is front and center. And again, this was not an especially new sentiment. In this book titled Ethnic Identity Groups and the U.S. Foreign Policy, there's a chapter by Catherine V. Scott called White Mischief, U.S. Support for Apartheid. And in it she writes here about the 60s that, I'll quote here, "But a different consideration seemed to be operating in Assistant Secretary of State Francis Wilcox's speech given a few weeks after the Sharpeville killings. Wilcox cautioned against the permanent withdrawal of the white man from positions of authority in South Africa. Racial privilege and strategic advantage worked in tandem to protect U.S. interests." End quote. So this was very much a palpable dynamic. And if you think about that, if you think about those considerations, think about this, that in an era defined by clamping down on immigration and where there are many bona fide persecuted groups around the world, that particular group, why offer a refugee status to that particular group? And not only that, but make a whole scene about making that declaration loud and clear. In many ways, this mirrors the shithole country's comments from Trump's first term. And if you think race got nothing to do with this, I want you to think about whether if Elon Musk was Carlos Slim of Mexico, or if he was Jack Ma of China, if he was Akilo Dangote of Nigeria, do you think he would have been? I would be interested in here. Let me know in the comments if you think that he would have been a part of this. He would have been in Trump's ear in this way. Oh, and speaking of Musk, we are here to the final factor that we'll consider today is the fact that the Musk factor, right? Now, we've already seen that back in 2018, Trump had comments about this, or this is something that's been on his radar. But if you have an influential white South African in your ear, you can bet that is a part of that noise as well. And you can see how Musk has even engaged with folks where he stands on this, right? So, or as Saturday Night Live just called him, White Kanye was born on June 28, 1971 in Pretoria, South Africa, the capital city, and at the time, the heart of apartheid. Growing up in this environment, Musk's early life was shaped by these different dynamics, right, in apartheid South Africa. So, and his family's history represents this varied and complex history. So, on one side, his dad, born in South Africa as well, Errol, was an engineer and developer, and even though he said he stated apartheid and was initially involved in the Progressive Federal Party, he left partly due to disagreements over their push for universal suffrage. So think about that, right? That even though he says he was against apartheid, he still left the party because they were pushing for one man, one vote. So still, and Musk himself, to be fair, to be transparent, Elon Musk has described his father as a terrible human being. On the other side, his maternal grandmother was born in Canada, but he moved to South Africa in 1950 because he loved apartheid so much. Elon's own admission, he was fanatic or in favor of apartheid. and used to support Hitler and all that stuff. These are quotes from Elon himself. So, and even outside of the politics, a lot of their wealth that they accumulated, the wealth from which he springs, the silver spoon in his mouth, came from the benefits of apartheid, right? So that's what this is. But let's just say I'm projecting because people are different. People, shout out to Ted Lasso. He himself, right, would go on to accuse Cyril Ramaphosa of being racist, and recently claiming he couldn't own this company because he's not black, and I mean totally twisting what the actual policy around the empowerment of lower income people, again still recovering victims of apartheid, is nuts. But in any case, so in addition to his family's experiences, Elon is also a global entrepreneur with diverse business ventures, and he just may be concerned about the potential economic ramifications of South Africa's land reform policies. You know, a lot of them, they destabilize, at least in the short term, economies. At least that's what happened with Zimbabwe, and again, that's a cautionary tale. Secondly, his own political alignments, not just with white nationalism, but also with certain political narratives that emphasize property rights and economic liberalism. So what does it all mean? Well, if things were to stay the same, I suspect two things are likely to happen. In the middle to long term, the Trump administration will maintain its stance, at least rhetorically, powered by Elon's ties to the country for as long as they remain cool, right? What's the over and under on that? The tears of white nationalists and ego. But unless there is a fundamental change in South Africa in either direction, right, whether they move towards land reform or this may not be something that keeps coming up. The issue itself, it might not keep coming up. South Africa, on the other hand, as long as the ANC retains power, will maintain its commitment to eventually reforming land ownership, at least rhetorically. However, the government has shown reticence toward any large-scale redistribution of land. They seem hesitant to upset the apple cart whence they also eat. With a society that is far more urbanized and has been so for so much longer than neighboring Zimbabwe, for example, it is far more likely that the battle against wealth disparities will take center stage in the urban areas. Not only do people in the rural areas subsist on the land, the government also recognizes the political clout of those communities, which is more pressing in Zimbabwe. So when I talk about the differences, South Africa has maybe like a 30% rural population. Zimbabwe has a 60+% rural population to this day, and it would have been closer to 70 when the land redistribution happened 25 years ago. What that means then is the pressure for land reform in the rural community that was Zimbabwe is a lot higher and almost less symbolic and out of necessity than it would be in South Africa, where I suspect that most of the trouble that at this rate of disparity, a lot of the trouble will happen in the cities and not in the rural areas. In South Africa, right, the ruling ANC doesn't have to worry about the rural areas. They have to balance the land reform with the interests of urban voters, the private sector, and international investors. So the ANC's approach has been more gradual and legalistic, fearing economic backlash like what happened in Zimbabwe. So piecemeal things will happen here and there in South Africa to placate the masses and maintain the power structures in South Africa as they are. This is what I predict, unless there is a change in government. We'll see.